Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History. We are very glad you're here with us. Before we get started, I have a few things I want to go over and just some announcements, and then we'll get started. So first of all, as I mentioned, thank you for joining us for this free program. We couldn't offer free programs for the public without support from those of you who have done so. Your financial support makes these kind of programs possible. We're very grateful for those who have done so. If you would like to make a donation, you can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the Donate Now button, and it will guide you through the process. We are very grateful for those who have done so and those who will choose to do so. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button. Those will come to us, and we'll do a Q&A session at the end. And if you have any technical issues, such as sound or you can't hear, again, use the Q&A button, and those will come to me. There is audio during this presentation. It is older audio, so just be aware that you might need to increase your volume and pay close attention during the presentation, as it's a little bit older audio, but I think it will be good. Let's see what else we got going on here. Next week for President's Day, Ralph Bugles will be joining us to present on presidents in unexpected places in the DC area. He's got a great program that he's put together that talks about different unique locations that the presidents visited and connections they have throughout the greater DMV. I think you'll enjoy that program. That'll be next Tuesday, February 22nd at 2 p.m. Also, National History Day is coming up. I've talked about this a lot, but we are in need of judges for this program. If you are available, if you would like to help foster a passion for history in the next generation, this is your chance. You don't need to be a history scholar. You don't need to be an expert. If you are one of those, you're more than welcome to participate. But this is more of the goal here is to encourage students to develop a love of history. So you can visit our website, click on events, and then History Day 2022, and that will guide you through the process of signing up. It's taking place online this year, so you won't even need to drive anywhere, and we'll have a whole week of judging, so you can do it at your own leisure there. So and again, if you have any questions during the program, you can send them through the Q&A, and we'll get to those. And I believe that's all I've got. Julianne, are you there?
Hello.
Hi. Okay, let me stop my screen share and we can get started here. Press that button.
Start my video?
Yep, if you want to go ahead and do that there. Again, everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. And I think we're all set. So Julianne, you are welcome to start whenever you are ready.
All right, thank you, Matt. Right, sure. Okay, hello everybody. So here, let's talk about Will Adams, the Fiddler of Ken-Gar. In 1953, two people from different worlds met in Montgomery County, Maryland. And Will Adams was an elderly African-American man from Ken-Gar, which is was at the time a predominantly Black neighborhood wedged between Kensington and Garrett Park. And Mike Seeger was a young man from the relatively upscale Chevy Chase, and he was the son of two prominent music scholars. His older half-brother was Pete Seeger, the famous folk singer and banjo player. Mike Seeger made field recordings of Will Adams playing the fiddle, and old-time music history was made. So let's start off by listening to Will Adams, and check your volume because I'm hearing that it's not coming out too loud, but let's see what happens.
I went down to Rexford and to get a bag of corn. Rexford set the dogs on me, and the parson blew the horn. See, that's it.
19-year-old Mike Seeger recorded Will Adams. It was the first of many field recordings he would make throughout his life. And he went on to be a prolific collector of traditional music and also a performer of it. He was a founding member of the New Lost City Ramblers, and in his later years, he started a mountain music and dance festival near his home in Lexington, Virginia. I wanted to know more about Will Adams, where he came from, and where he might have learned his music. And while doing this research, I realized that by studying his family history, it gives us all a glimpse into African American life in Montgomery County from the final years of slavery and into the mid-20th century. And in addition, the musical legacies of both men, Will Adams and Mike Seeger, live on to this day.
Julianne,
yes.
Sorry, can you move your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Oh, sure.
Let's see if that's.
Is that?
That's much better. There you go.
Oh, okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
All right. Am I okay now?
Yeah, you sound great now.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I'd like to just orient you all on where Ken-Gar is. So this is a recent map, and this black road on the right side of the map, that's Connecticut Avenue. And so imagine that down here is the Capitol Beltway, and you're going north on Connecticut Avenue towards Kensington. And you get to Kensington, and then there's Pliers Mill Road. So you make a left on Pliers Mill Road. And this building here is the fire station. And if you keep on going, you'll see on your left a bridge that goes off to the left over the railroad bridge. But if you keep going on Pliers Mill Road, you end up in this neighborhood of Ken-Gar. And as you can see, all the streets are dead ends. So if you want to leave Ken-Gar, you have to turn around and go back exactly the same way that you came. So another thing before we go on, I'd like to clarify the names that I'll be using. Will Adams' full name was William Winfield Adams Jr. And if I say Will or Will Adams, I'm referring to the Fiddler of Ken-Gar. His father was also named Will Adams. So if I say William Sr., I'm referring to his father. And then his grandfather was also named William Adams. So if I say grandfather William, I'm referring to him. And then as for Mike Seeger, well, I knew him and I always called him Mike. So I'll probably slip into referring to him by his first name just out of habit. I met him in the late 1980s at an academic conference for folk dance at East Tennessee State University. And he was there to promote a documentary he had just completed called Talking Feet, which was about solo step dance traditions of the Appalachian, Blue Ridge, and Piedmont areas of the South. And I was there not as an academic, but as somebody who is enthusiastic about Appalachian clogging. And at the time, I ran a venue for old time music and dance in Silver Spring, and I was really eager to learn anything I could about the dance. So here's the story of how Mike Seeger ended up in Ken-Gar recording Will Adams. And much of this information comes from the liner notes of this album, which is an anthology of some of the field recordings that Mike Seeger did over his life. And one of the cuts was of Will Adams. And then other details of the story came from notes that Mike wrote to old-time musicians that were interested in Will Adams, and those were shared with me. So one day in late 1952, Mike Seeger went to Meadowbrook Stables in Rock Creek Park to meet a friend who was working there. And while he waited for his friend to finish cleaning out a stable, he sat down and started playing his banjo. And at the time, he was learning how to play the banjo, so he carried it with him everywhere he went. And as he was playing in the stables, he attracted the attention of an African-American stable hand named Sam, who said to Mike, I used to play the banjo. And so Mike handed over his banjo. And even though Sam said he hadn't played quite some time, Mike thought that he had a pretty solid style of clawhammer banjo playing. So he asked if he could record him. And Sam said sure, and said that he could be found in Ken-Gar, which was a neighborhood of Kensington. So Mike Seeger showed up in Ken-Gar in early 1953 with a reel-to-reel tape recorder. He described it as, quote, a very bulky magnecord in a nice mahogany cabinet and an even heavier playback unit. So I looked at the 1953 catalog, and this is the only one that is advertised as having a wood cabinet. It might be the one he used, but as you can see from the description, it's like 38 inches tall and 25 inches wide and deep. Later on, it was said that Mike got a hold of one of their models called an M33, which was much smaller, and it only weighed 40 pounds. So not what we would consider portable today, but it was state of the art for field recording at the time. And it was a huge improvement over the disc recorders that people like John Lomax used for field recordings in the 30s for the WPA. So Mike didn't know where Sam lived, but he just went to a small store on Bonnycastle Avenue and asked where he could be found. But no one could tell him where he was. But they did say, well, there's this Will Adams who used to play music with him back in the day. So Mike went to Will Adams' house and convinced him to play some fiddle tunes and have them recorded. And Will Adams said he hadn't played in 25 years and he didn't even own a fiddle anymore. But fortunately, Mike had one with him, so he just handed it over and let Adams start playing. So over a number of visits in early 1953, Mike recorded him playing dozens of tunes. And Will Adams had a varied repertoire that included like old-time square dance tunes, waltzes, rags, and even Irish jigs. And Mike thought that some of the tunes that he played that Mike himself didn't recognize, he thought that might have come from a local tradition. He wasn't sure. But this tune that I'm about to play for you is called Tire Dog Sally Gal, and it's one for which neither Mike nor any other folklorist has ever found an earlier source for. It appears to be unique to Will Adams, and if Mike hadn't recorded it, it might have been lost forever.
This Tie Dog Sally Gal.
Will Adams had a strong sense of rhythm, which would be important for playing for dances. And he didn't always play the melody the same way on every repeat. He put in variations. And also he did things like he used double stops occasionally, which is when you draw the bow across two strings at the same time, creating somewhat of a chord. And then sometimes he'd play the melody in the upper register, and the next time through he'd play it through a lower one. But what's really amazing about his playing is that he remembered so many tunes, 40 in all, so long after he'd last played, after so many years. And Mike Seeger knew he'd only captured a portion of Adams' repertoire, and he always regretted not going back and collecting more. And when Mike came to Ken-Gar, Will lived at the western end of Hamden Street behind the Lee African Methodist Episcopal Church. So this is how his family came to be in Ken-Gar. Ken-Gar was established in 1892 by Henry N. Kopp, who owned the land and then had it surveyed in 1893. It was divided into 7 blocks with a total of 97 lots. And it was called Ken-Gar because it was between Kensington and Garrett Park. And although Ken-Gar eventually became an African-American neighborhood, it wasn't until 1903 that the first lot was sold to a Black person. Lot 7 in Block 3 down here was sold to the trustees of the Lee AME Church. And then one of the trustees, Reverend John Nelson Still, bought all of the other lots within Block 3. The church drew several African American families to the area. And when the church transferred Reverend Still out of Montgomery County in 1909, he sold his lots to both whites and blacks. And one of those buyers was William Senior, who bought 2 lots behind the Lee AME Church, which would be this 13 and 14 here. Some of the people who moved to Ken-Gar were Baptists, including William Senior. So at first, the Baptists met in various people's private homes. Eventually, though, the First Baptist Church of Ken-Gar was built in 1921 on lot 22 of Block 2, which is right here. So anchored by its 2 churches, Ken-Gar became the kind of place where African Americans coming to the Washington, D.C. area could get their start. And residents of Ken-Gar tended gardens, and they raised like chickens and pigs there, and it gave it a rather rural feel to the neighborhood. Although, to be honest, most of that area was agricultural in those days. But anyway, I suspect this is why William Senior bought 2 lots, because if you look at this map from 1941, you can see he's only built on one of those lots, so he was likely using the other half to have a garden. And in fact, from 1905 to 1921, this whole block here, Block 5, that was all owned by one person, and it was used as a farm. So the main avenue in Ken-Gar is here, Bonnycastle Avenue, which is now known as Pliers Mill Road. But in the early days, when it was called Bonnycastle Avenue, it would go west just north of the B&O train tracks, and it would go west and it would head on out of Ken-Gar and eventually end up in Garrett Park. However, in the 1920s, Knowles Avenue was built on the south side of the railroad tracks, and that also went west and connected with Garrett Park via Strathmore Avenue. So that became the preferred road for whatever reason, and Bonnycastle Avenue west of Ken-Gar eventually, fell into disuse and was abandoned. Homes in Ken-Gar in the early 20th century were wood, either shacks or actual houses. And they didn't have any running water, so people used wells, and there was a public pump, I was told, and they used outdoor privies. And the streets were unpaved. Absentee landlords bought lots, built houses, and rented them. And after the stock market crash in 1929, there were a lot of people who couldn't keep up with their mortgage payments, so they lost their homes. And those who chose to remain in Ken-Gar probably turned to the rental housing. So Ken-Gar's isolation made it seem like a small rural town to Mike Seeger in 1953, but it also made it easy for the government to overlook this African-American enclave. There was a significant problem with landlords who let their properties become run down. Now, people in Ken-Gar who owned their homes, they were able to make improvements like adding bathrooms, but tenants were at the mercy of the landlords, who might choose to ignore their requests for repairs or basic amenities, and complaints to the county often went ignored. But some of the white neighbors to Ken-Gar, they advocated for improvements to the neighborhood, and they pitched in the areas of education and healthcare. Due to segregation, Ken-Gar had its own school. And then when the segregation of public schools ended in the 1950s, the inadequacies of the educations that students were getting in Ken-Gar became apparent. And there was a white woman from Kensington named Carla Oyster who started a tutoring service in 1958 to help students from Ken-Gar catch up with their peers in the integrated schools. And there were also two doctors, Herman Myersberg and George Cohen, who started a free clinic to address the community's medical needs. And the doctors would meet with patients in the basement of the First Baptist Church of Ken-Gar. And it wasn't until 1960 that the county required landlords to provide toilets and bathrooms in the houses. And Ken-Gar didn't get trash removal until 1961, and it was 1970s before they got sewer service. Also in the 1970s, the last of the dirt roads in Ken-Gar were paved and given sidewalks and streetlights. There were also incidents of harassment by local whites, and they would drive through Ken-Gar, and as it was said, 3 or 4 times a week, and shout racial epithets at the residents. And in 1972, a carload of teenagers did this, and they were shouting insults, but they were also throwing firecrackers at a small group of Ken-Gar residents that were gathered in the road. So unfortunately, the teenagers didn't realize that Pliers Mill Road dead ended. And so they were forced to turn around their car and to leave Ken-Gar. They had to drive by the same people that they had just harassed. And unfortunately, one of them had a gun. And although he said that he was just firing warning shots, one of the teenagers was shot and killed. And the person who did the shooting was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He got out after on parole after just 2 years. And there's more to Ken-Gar's history than I can put into this talk. And I just want to say that it holds an important place in local Black history, being one of the many communities in Montgomery County that were havens for African Americans during segregation. But now I'd like to get back to Will Adams. When Will Adams' parents bought the house in Ken-Gar, Will himself was 28 years old and, obviously living on his own. He had a wife and he had several children. It was his first wife, Mary, and he probably moved to Ken-Gar around 1917. And this World War I draft registration card, as you can see, was filled out in 1918, and he gives Kensington, Maryland as his address. He was counted in the 1920 census, living close to his parents in Ken-Gar and living with his second wife, Florence. Since I wasn't able to find any evidence that Will Adams ever bought a house in Ken-Gar, I'm assuming that he lived in the rental housing, and he moved into the house on Hampden Street later after his mother died in 1936. Will Adams made his living as a laborer, working on farms and doing odd jobs. On his World War II draft card, he said he was employed by William A. Wagner, who had a plumbing company, which is still in existence today. In fact, that's the plumber I use. But not much more of that is known about Adams' life. Today, the few people I found who recognized his name were unaware of his fiddle playing. So I turned to genealogy to learn more about his family history. William Sr. was born a free person of color in 1849, the son of grandfather William and Rachel Adams. According to the 1850 census, when he was a year old, his family lived in the Howard district of Anne Arundel County, which later became Howard County. In the 1860 census, grandfather William was living alone in Sandy Spring, and it appears Rachel Adams has died before 1860, and William Sr. Was living with another family nearby. In the 1860 census, no, I already did that. Sorry. In the 1870 census, there's no sign of grandfather William, so I believe he too has died by that time. And then William Sr. is living in someone else's household and working as a laborer. Now, according to Will Adams' death certificate, he was born in 1881 in Maryland. And because both his father and his grandfather lived there, I suspect he spent much of his younger years in the Sandy Spring area. There was a small village of African Americans around Sandy Spring that were based on slaves that had been freed by the Quakers of Sandy Spring in the late 18th and early 19th century. And if you look at this map, it indicates that there are many of these property owners are people of color. According to the 1880 census, William Seeger was a boarder in the home of Caroline Hood, who was Will Adams' mother. And she, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Oh, so she lived in the Berry district of Montgomery County, which was the eastern part of the county, roughly like from Silver Spring and going on up north through Wheaton and Norbeck and all the way up to Sandy Spring. And given that Will Adams was born in 1881, I assume that Will Adams and Caroline Hood married shortly after the census was taken. Caroline Adams' death certificate named John and Susan Hood as her parents, and it was said that she was born in Norbeck in 1853. And since I couldn't find this family in the 1850 or 1860 censuses, I assume that they were enslaved at the time. So I turned to the Montgomery County slave statistics to see if I could find them. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what the slave census was, and then tell you how I used it to find Caroline's family. In 1867, the Maryland Assembly passed a law to gather information on slaveholders and the slaves they held on November 1st, 1864, when slavery was abolished in Maryland by the passage of their new constitution. Former slaveholders felt that they were owed something for the state having stayed loyal to the Union during the war, and they wanted to use the statistics to petition the federal government to compensate them for their slaves who had served in the Union Army. Now, it bothers me that they didn't use this information to compensate people who had been held in captivity or forced to work with no pay, but so it goes. The federal government never compensated the slaveholders, and nevertheless, the state slave statistics remain an important piece of documentation about the state of slavery in Maryland. And enslaved people were, like I said, were generally not named in the U.S. censuses during the time that slavery was in force. So having a document that lists who held them, what their names were, their ages, sex, health, term of servitude, all of that is a remarkable resource for historians and genealogists. As I said, according to her death certificate, Caroline Hood Adams, Will Adams' mother, was born in Norbeck to John and Susan Hood. In the slave statistics, I found John and Susan Hood being held by Jane Adamson, who owned a farm that was adjacent to Muncaster's Mill in Norbeck. So this, let me just show you on the right side of the screen, this hash marked road in the map, I believe it indicates a toll road. And this is the Washington and Brookville Turnpike, which eventually became known as Georgia Avenue. So if you imagine that down here in the lower right corner that you're coming from Wheaton and you're headed up and you get to Norbeck Road right here and you make a left on Norbeck Road, and soon after you make a right on Muncaster Mill Road, it takes you over to Muncaster's Mill. And as you can see, the Adamson family owns property adjacent to the mill. So it seems likely that Will's mother, Caroline, was born into slavery at the Adamson farm. The Susan Hood in the slave statistics would have been about 39 at the time of her birth. And I wasn't able to find a Susan Hood in the 1870 census, so perhaps she died by then. And John Hood in the slave statistics was 25 years younger than Susan and would have been 14 when Caroline was born. I found later census records for a John Hood in Montgomery County who was born around 1835, and it seems likely that he's Caroline's father, and he would have been 18 when she was born. And I also think he might be the same John Hood that's in the slave statistics, because the ages aren't that far off. And in the sources where I follow this John Hood, it's like there was a wide variance in the year of birth that was reported. So that's my best guess. But anyway, he died in Rockville in 1911. So based on what I found in the slave statistics, I think I've located where Caroline Adams was probably born. And although I didn't find her with her parents at the time, it's possible that she had been sold to someone else, separating her from them. And sadly, having her family ripped apart like that was a trauma that happened all too frequently to African Americans. To do this research, I didn't have to go to the Maryland State Archives and look at the original ledger, but because that information and more is searchable through the Legacy of Slavery in Maryland website. But I wanted to see the original for myself as a way to bear witness of how prevalent slavery was in Montgomery County. The history that I learned as a child led me to believe that slavery only happened in the Deep South. And looking at this ledger, written in careful 19th century penmanship, I saw concrete proof of the extent of slavery in Montgomery County. And it also helped me grasp how much of the county's progress was built on the backs of enslaved laborers. Getting back to Will Adams, I wondered, where did he learn to play the fiddle? And Mike Seeger's notes indicated that he played music in Sandy Spring with Sam, the banjo player, who Mike never found.
Getting up cows. That's the call, getting up cows. The old fellow played that bad. He was a crackerjack on fiddler, though. I don't believe it could be beat. I'm sorry, an old man he was. I don't know, I forget how that goes, though. I ain't gonna play lost as on.
In this audio clip, Will mentions an old fella, a crackerjack fiddle, who taught him the tune. So there was an earlier generation of old-time musicians in Montgomery County from whom Will Adams could have learned. Will Adams told Mike that he played both for white and black audiences, and he likely played for private parties, country dances, or community events around Sandy Spring, Norbeck, and elsewhere around the county. And I found a society item in a 1932 issue of Montgomery County Sentinel for a party thrown by a family, white family in Glen Echo for their 17-year-old daughter. And the guests, quote, danced to the music of several colored fiddlers, end quote. So one of them could have been Will Adams. And it's also passably played at a local tavern like the Dewdrop Inn in Emery Grove, another African-American community. One of the tunes Will played for Mike Seeger was called Wild Horse at Stony Point. And when he finishes playing the tune, he says, I heard a fellow play it one time at a beer joint. Now, it'll probably remain a mystery exactly where Will Adams played his music, but the strength of his repertoire as we know it and his playing just tells me that he must have known a lot of musicians and had a lot of musicians around him to play and learn from. So I want to say that I first heard of Will Adams in 1988 when I heard a band called the Hellbenders play Tired Dog Sally Gal. Except when they heard Will introduce the tune, they thought he said tight old Sally Gal. So that's what they call it on this album. So I'm going to play this clip, and it's a modern clip. So if you cranked up your volume for the other ones, you might want to be ready in case this is a little too loud for you, okay? banjo duet, Bruce Melsky and David Winston put their own unique imprint on Will Adams' melody. And this is what's called the folk process. And actually, Will Adams himself probably did the same thing when he learned a tune. The Hellbenders were based in Lexington, Virginia, where Mike Seeger lived from about 1982 until his death in 2009. And he shared his recordings of Will Adams to several interested parties over the years. And these tapes were copied and passed around among other old time musicians. And that's kind of why Will Adams tunes are still played today in the old time music community. Mike Seeger left his papers and field recordings and other materials with the Southern Folklife Collection at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And the recordings he made of Will Adams have been digitized and they're available online. I'd forgotten all about Will Adams until fall of 2021, and I'd like to take a little side trip through his cemetery to explain how he came back on my radar again. Since last year, I've been working on a project with members of the Montgomery County chapter of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society, and we're researching the Mount Pleasant Methodist Church Cemetery in Norbeck. And several members of the group belong to the church that succeeded Mount Pleasant, including the project leader, Chiquita Sorrells. Norbeck was once the home of an African American community. And in the late 19th and 20th centuries, this community consisted of it was held together by a church, a school, a lodge, and then there was the cemetery. And they were all on the same property on Muncaster Mill Road, near where Norbeck Road crosses it. The lodge building, which is the one in the middle background, was torn down several decades ago. And the school is now a county recreation center. The church was sold to the church building was sold to another church called Waves of Glory. And then that was because the Mount Pleasant Church joined the Jerusalem Methodist Church in Rockville. And then the cemetery is still owned by this merged congregation, which is now known by the name Jerusalem Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church. There are no burial records for the cemeteries, so all we've had to rely on as part of this project is about 30 visible grave markers and then 140 obituaries found in the Evening Star newspaper. So we decided to select a few names from this list and trace their family trees. And it turned out that one of the deceased was Hiawatha Adams. And Louise Waldron had researched his name and reported to the group that Hiawatha's father was named Will Adams, and he'd been recorded by Mike Seeger in the 1950s. Well, of course, I heard that and my ears perked up. And so remembering, the history of Mike Seeger and Will Adams, I decided to research his music and his genealogy, building on what Louise had started. So we learned that not only did Will's son get buried here, but William Sr. and Caroline Adams are also buried at this cemetery in Norbeck. Now, as far as I know, Will Adams never picked up the fiddle again after Mike recorded him, and he died 6 years later in 1959 and is buried at Ash Memorial Cemetery in Sandy Spring. And Will Adams' house in Ken-Gar was sold in 1966 to a developer who demolished it and built an apartment building on the site. Ken-Gar today is more diverse than it was in 1953, and people there are rightfully proud of its history. In 2017, they celebrated its 125th year, and in 2020, the Summit Avenue Bridge, which connects Ken-Gar with the rest of Kensington, was painted with a mural that honors it, and it's painted with houses and the two churches and the school. And the artist's name is Nicole Bourget, who has painted other public murals in Montgomery County. Mike Seeger's legacy goes beyond his field recording with Will Adams and Ken-Gar. He went on to record many other musicians, Elizabeth Cotton, Leadbelly, Lester Flatt, Doc Watson, and many more. And he was a founding member of the New Lost City Ramblers, which was a seminal band for the folk revival in the 1950s and 1960s. And then, as I said before, later on, he started the Rockbridge Mountain Music and Dance Festival in Buena Vista, Virginia, which is near his Lexington home. And he created a festival where people could gather every year and share their love of old time music and dance. And I attended nearly every year until the pandemic came along. So I took these photos at the festival in 2001 when the old time music community put on a tribute to Mike Seeger. And it just happened to be 4 days after the September 11 tragedy. But it turned out to be better timing than you might think, because we all needed a reason to celebrate something. And this was a good reason. The tribute to Mike was fitting given his contributions, but it was also a chance for us to ground ourselves in our common love of old time music and dance. If you want to know more about Mike Seeger, he has a website, and it's all about his music and himself. And let's see. So this is where my interest in Will Adams took me, and further research might turn up some new details. And as a local historian and genealogist, I'm looking forward to a couple of things in the coming year. One of them is more local newspapers to be digitized. That will help a lot. But also that on April 1st, 2022, will be the release of the personal information from the 1950 census. So those are all things that might provide more clues about his life. Here's some other resources I thought you might like to know about. One, Jake Blunt is a fiddler and ethnomusicologist who's studied Will Adams, and he plays his music. And if any of you attended the 2021 Montgomery County History Conference, he did a session where he played some of Will's music. And his website features a page that has links to Black String Band's resources. Christina Gaddy wrote a blog post about Will Adams in 2020. And then finally, this is a blog post that I just put out as a companion to this talk, and it contains links to all the resources that I mentioned in this talk, plus some others, including a couple of recordings of contemporary musicians that are playing Will Adams music today. So before I take questions, I'd like to thank a few people. First of all, Montgomery History for hosting this talk, Sarah Headland of Montgomery History Library, the Sandy Springs Slave Museum, Kensington Historical Society, Peerless Rockville, and Ralph Buglas, Chiquita Soros, Louise Waldron, Natalie Thomas, Mary Buckingham, David Winston, Scott Prouty, and of course, my husband, Bob Cantor. Okay. Oh, and I want to thank you all too.
Okay. Well, thank you, Julianne, for your presentation and for the musical interludes there. So we'll just get right into questions here. Again, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And I'll try and get to those. So first of all, someone mentions one document said he had some fingers maimed on his left hand. Can you address that? Do you know more about that?
Yes, I do. One of the things that was in one of the notes that I was given about Mike, he did mention that that Will Adams had a maimed pinky, but he seemed to be able to play okay. I have no idea how that happened, but I would say if you are a farm laborer, these things can happen. But it's interesting you bring it up, because when I was trying to sort of suss out all the different Will Adamses that there are, and there's more than just the three I mentioned, I saw this note that he had mangled fingers, and I was like, oh, well, this guy can't be the fiddler because how could he play with mangled fingers? But then I saw Mike's note, and then of course we all remember that Django Reinhardt did pretty good with mangled fingers too. So there you go.
Okay. Um, let's see here. Someone says, just a comment from someone, you mentioned one of the two doctors who offered medical services to Ken-Gar residents was Dr. George Cohen. They say, my bet is that this is the same George Cohen who lived in Lux Manor and moved about 10 years ago to a condo in Park Potomac and is still alive.
I don't know Dr. Cohen, but I do know that in the program for the 2017 celebration of Ken-Gar, the 125th anniversary, I believe he was on the program. So yes, it's possible he's still alive. That's all I know about him, though.
Okay. I was waiting for this one. Could you tell us about the duct taped banana on the wall behind you?
I'd love to tell you about the duct tape banana on the wall. Okay, so there's a fine artist named Maurizio Catalan he's a modern artist, and he taped a banana to a wall, and this piece of art was sold for I think it was like $130,000, and then he sold another one for another $130,000, and I just went to Michael's and got a plastic banana, and I used my own duct tape. It cost me way less. So this is my statement on the state of modern art.
Okay. Not related to Will Adams at all, of course, but I did get a couple questions about that. So when was Will Adams born? Do we have records of that?
Okay, so it turns out that the Maryland state records only go back to like 1898. There is some question about exactly when he's born, but I do think it probably was 1881, just based on that. I believe his parents weren't even married yet. I mean, I don't know what things. He was not listed. Will Adams himself was not listed in the 1880 census, so I believe that he was born probably in 1881. I do have some documents say he was, and another one said he was born in 1880. So I'm sticking with 1881, and it's a good question, but if you've done genealogy, the farther back you go, the less well documented things like that are, believe it or not. So that's my best guess is 1881.
Okay. Here's another comment kind of about the source for his music. The viewer says, several years ago, I attended a Scottish music festival, and there were several sessions of fiddlers, individuals, and his groups that played music just like this. The pattern is to repeat several measures, then go into a different pattern of notes again and repeated, then on to the next set. There's no words attached to this, and it's all played very quickly. She suggests that it might have been brought over by Scottish immigrants and then kind of picked up by the enslaved. Do you have any thoughts on that? Any comments?
Well, I think it's difficult to actually say this is how old time music started. There's clearly an African influence and there's a European influence. And I know that when Jake Blunt talked at the history conference last year, I mean, he made a strong point about that. People think today of old time music as being white music with some African American influences. In his case was no, he was like, no, I think that we don't give African Americans enough credit for their contributions to old time music because they're not as many players now. But also, I mean, I think there's a sort of, I don't know how you call it, but the white default is like, if we notice that there's music that has a clear African kind of thing, we'll give them credit for that. But when it doesn't sound like that, we take all the credit, and I don't think that's right. I think that Jake is right in saying that the two influences are so equally and inextricably bound that it's really hard to It's hard to say where it comes from, but I do say it's both European and African-American influences equally. And I'll leave it to the ethnomusicologists to untangle that, exactly that happened. But that's, as a almost lifelong fan of old time music, that's my take on it. So, for what it's worth. Anyway, I appreciate the question because I think it is good to talk about this sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. A further comment from Sarah Hedlund, actually, the Montgomery History archivist and librarian. So hi, Sarah, thanks for joining us. She says, and this is kind of further on the missing fingers thing. She says, I noticed on his draft card, it said he was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. This would obviously make him a very remarkable fiddler, as usually the left hand is the one that plays the notes. Is it possible he played the other way, with his left hand using the bow and the right playing fingers, or was he playing the tunes with only 2 fingers?
Well, no, it sounds like he was using all of his fingers, even though they were mangled. And my guess is that he noted the fiddle on the neck with his left hand, because Mike would have definitely said that he, made it. That would be the kind of thing a folklorist would note if the instrument was being played other than the standard way. So that's my take, is that somehow he had some use of that finger, even though it probably, when he say maimed, it might have just been like bent, but still usable. I don't know. But it's a good question, but I think that he did play the fiddle with his left hand, noting the fiddle on with his left hand.
Okay. Are there any descendants of Will Adams here or in the Ken-Gar area?
This has been very hard for me to determine. You would think, because he had quite a few children, that I'd be able to turn them up, but I haven't been able to. And part of the problem is that, for example, some of his children, I think, moved to DC, and if they died in DC, I would not be able to get a death certificate. Now, Hiawatha, he died in DC, but he got an obituary, so I knew when and where he died. And the other problem is that Adams is a very common name. And of course, as I said before, right now, all we have is the census data up to 1940. And another reason why it's been difficult, not just the fact that Adams is a very common name, but also his youngest children were female. So they may have married, and I have no idea, what their married names are. But so we might find out more about his descendants in the 1950 census. We'll just have to see. But it's a good question. I know that I think that's it's understandable to want to, reach the descendants, but I do have the sense that since he gave up playing fiddle fairly early in his life, that his children may really not have much, or his grandchildren at this point, may not have any memories of him being a fiddle player. And that's just my point of view, in that I'm more interested in his fiddle playing, obviously. If I thought I could find a lot more about his fiddle playing, I'd be more excited about finding his descendants. But like I said, I did try, and it's been very difficult.
Okay. Can you repeat the name of the slave name collection from 1864, the Slavery Legacy website, and the name of the group of Montgomery County Black genealogical history?
Okay, let me look at my notes, because in Montgomery History, I believe has digital files so that you can look at the slave census. So it's got such a long name, I don't even have it memorized. And you know what? I don't have it in my notes. I'm sorry. I can tell you this: if you go to that my website, juliannemangian.com, and right now the top article is the one about Will Adams, and if you go through that, you will find my citation for that work. And see, now they asked about there's a Montgomery County chapter of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. I always forget which way. I don't have their website handy, but maybe there's somebody in the audience who knows the URL for their website and could put it in the comments or the Q&A or whatever. And
I was hoping Sarah would
jump.
it was the Slavery Legacy website.
Oh, well, yeah. See, if you know what, I can give you that if I can get out of my.
Sarah Headland says she's working on it, so if we're patient, we'll get an answer from the local expert.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come.
Great.
We'll come back to that one. I've always heard it called the slave census, and and that's what I've always assumed, but I don't know that off. I think I don't know if it was the Maryland slave census.
Well, I think what happened was originally when I went to Montgomery History Library to work with the materials, all Sarah had was the it was a transcription done by Jane Sween, and that was a useful tool. But I began Googling and also looking at Ancestry, and I found some page images. And this isn't like a regular book; it's a ledger. It's not like a published book. It's a one-off ledger. But when they ordered this ledger, it had a running title across the top that said, record of slaves in the state of Maryland. I can't remember the exact thing. I apologize. The problem I'm having is that if I stop I can find it if I stop sharing my,
of course.
PowerPoint.
I've had a couple people, Sarah and Eileen McGuckian have chimed in, and Chiquita Sorrells, of course, has chimed in. So it's the Montgomery chapter of AAHGS, which their website is aahgsmocomd.org. That's a mouthful there, but aahgsmocomd.org. And there's also slavery.msa.maryland.gov.
Yes.
Okay, and the official title for the slave census is the record of slaves in Montgomery County, Maryland, at the time of the adoption of the Constitution in 1864. Whew, also a mouthful.
Yeah, that was a mouthful. It's like one of those ones I didn't even bother trying to memorize because I only have so much room up here.
I'm going to put that in the chat so those people, so everyone can see that, for those of you who are interested in seeing that, and it will also show up in the answered questions.
And also, like I said, go to my website and you'll see I'll have links and things, although I didn't have a link to the AAHGS, but so thank you very much, Chiquita, whoever threw that into the chat.
And Sarah Headland also says that there is a transcription of that available, of the record of slaves in Montgomery County, 1864, in the Sween Library. So if you are interested in seeing that, you can set up a research appointment and take a look at that. Okay, a few more questions here. We'll get wrapped up here real quick. Someone asks if the local church might have any records of Will Adams and his descendants.
Yes, that's a possibility. I have to say, I think that's a very good question. And I don't know if you remember, Matt, exactly when I got the idea to do this talk, but I really made some choices about what I was going to put in the talk and what I would research. But clearly there's much more that can be done with it. But one of the things that I didn't do was touch base with the church. But that is an idea.
Okay. Let's see here. Is there a place that people can hear the recordings of him? Are those available online anywhere?
Yes, and they're at again, I have the URL for it in my blog post. If you when you get towards the end and I talk about how the Southern Folklife collection at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, they have them online, and Now, in hindsight, I should have gathered up all these URLs and slapped them in the chat, but I didn't. But like I said, I tried to make it easy on everybody as far as taking notes, to just know that there are so many of these links in the blog post that I created.
Okay.
But they're online, and the thing is, they're in one long continuous. It's not like separate MP3s for each tune. It's a long continuous thing, but it's very. I found it enjoyable to just listen to it as I went about my day.
Okay, I'm actually trying. I'm in the background here. I'm like frantically searching up, scrolling down the page of your
blog
website.
post?
Yeah, just to put that in the chat for people here.
Oh, if you would, that would be great. I appreciate it so much.
So that actually leads directly to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill there. So, okay. I think we're going to wrap things up there. I know there was a few other questions, but they're a little bit more specific to you, Julianne, and not specifically to Will Adams. So I'm going to suggest that you, if you would like to learn a little bit more about that, you can certainly email Julianne. As her email's right there on the screen, or you can reply to the registration email you got from Zoom, and I can connect you with Julianne. As we wrap up, Julianne, any last thoughts or comments for our audience today?
I have to say that this has been a very enjoyable project. I mean, I've only been really involved with local history maybe for a few years, and I've really enjoyed it. But this was a chance for me to contribute and involve my own personal knowledge of the old time music community, which has been a big part of my life since since I first took my first clogging lesson at the Montgomery County Recreation Department in 1980. And so much of my life and my social life has been wrapped up in this music. It means a great deal. And for me to be able to combine it with local history and share it with people has been a very enjoyable thing for me. And I really thank all the people who have contacted me about it, and the people who listen to this talk. I just feel very much appreciated. So thank you very much.
Okay. So yeah, again, I have lots of people saying great talk. Thank you so much. So Julianne, thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll have a recording of this available on our website next Monday. Well, probably Tuesday, since it is President's Day, but we'll have it available. And also sign up to be a judge for National History Day. We need your help, and you can help and give back to the community. So if you have any questions about that, you can certainly send me an email. So Julianne, thank you. Everyone, have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.